Hello and welcome back to The Walking Dead Retrospective, where today we'll be beginning our journey through Season 5, and finally getting into the meat of the Fear the Hunters arc. Get it? Meat, because they're cannibals? Season 5 is of particular interest in the retrospective sense, as this is when the show peaked in terms of popularity by nearly every measure. So in these videos covering Season 5, I'll also pay close attention to the exact points where, and reasons why, people may have begun to tune out. But with that said, let us get into it. As per usual, I like to start a new season with a bit of a meta discussion and look at the external factors surrounding the series, starting with the trailer. And Season 5 is a bit of a special case, as this is the only time in the series where a large part of the trailer's premise is actually complete lies. The trailer opens with what you'd expect: the gang stuck in the train cart and then being escorted to a room within Terminus itself. Though it's here where we were baited. We see Bob tell Gareth that one of them knows what caused the zombie outbreak and all they have to do is get him to Washington. This line does of course end up in the show, though Gareth's response of, "You join us, we go to Washington and cure this thing," never does. We have of course seen some trickery from the editors before, such as in the case of Season 3 with the whole Rick talking to the governor super early diversion, though nothing on the scale of purposely filming fake scenes to mislead viewers. Obviously, my point of view will be biased simply because I was familiar with the source material, but I sort of enjoyed this kind of switcheroo. Very often nowadays we talk about how trailers reveal way too much of a movie / show or whatever. Well, in this case, it technically not only showed you very little, but it also completely flipped what you did see on its head. And while yes, that did involve purposely lying to the viewer, I don't think anyone will be too angry to find out that the trailer of all things may have been designed to mislead, especially with how far we are into the story already. If it were a first season, sure, the trailer should be representative of what we'd actually see, but let's be real, seeing a trailer won't make or break a 5th season for most people. Though in a broader sense, as usual, the music in the trailer absolutely slaps. I won't try to pronounce it, but the name is on screen. Though aside from that, in my opinion, this trailer is sort of forgettable. In large part, I think just due to them wanting to hide the events following Terminus for obvious reasons, though because of that, we get very little in terms of interesting set pieces or anything like that. And as such, it can seem a little bland. Though I do have to give massive props for the other promotional material, as we also get the awesome Survive posters and, even more importantly, the very signature Hunt or Be Hunted one. Both of these really do stick out to me even to this day as some of those great ones. Though zooming out for a moment, I think an important thing to realize in retrospect is the state of the franchise as a whole when we were going into Season 5. In short, it was Walking Dead everything. Around this time, the spin-off Cobalt, later to be renamed Fear the Walking Dead, was announced, the Telltale series was in its 2nd season, the Walking Dead game by Overkill was announced, on top of the comic books and all the merchandise that was already being sold. Some obviously did better than others. The Overkill game even managed something that, as far as I recall, I've never seen done before. They released a fully developed game and it was playable for 3 months. But due to its poor reception, it was pulled from all stores and was just cancelled back in 2019. It wasn't anything to write home about, that's for sure, though I don't think it warranted being completely pulled from every store in existence and being thrown into a pseudo-cancellation. It's been almost 3 years and there hasn't even been a peep, so I guess it is indeed dead in the water. But regardless, the point is the franchise was expanding rapidly. And while that's not a bad thing per se, it does bring up the question of oversaturation and overexposure. If you've seen my Decline of the Walking Dead video, this is one of the major points that I brought up. Scarcity is a very valuable thing in marketing. So deliberately filling that demand is very risky because it may pay off, but it may also lead to wavering interest in the franchise as a whole, simply due to there being too much of it. Many studies have been done on this, and it really affects us much more than most of us would like to admit. So just keep that in mind moving forward. If it could have the Walking Dead name on it, it most likely did. Though moving closer to the story, I wanted to talk about the pacing of the season, as I think there's something very interesting here. For those of you unfamiliar with the source material, this will become clearer as we get into the season, but the pacing of the episodes is absolutely all over the place between the comic canon and the TV show exclusive storylines. To give you some pure numbers, Season 5 adapted roughly 16 issues, seemingly making that around one issue per episode. Though that is very deceptive. Excluding Terminus, the Fear the Hunters arc consisting of 5 issues was adapted in less than 2 episodes. So if you recall the absurd pacing of Season 3, this was similar, if not faster than that. Though when we get to the TV show exclusive storyline involving Beth and the return to Atlanta, which we will tackle next video, things slow down quite a bit. But when we roll back around to the source material in late Season 5, the pace picks right back up again. I still remember thinking that since they diverged from the source material in early Season 5, we probably wouldn't get to see Alexandria right up until the season finale. Though that would obviously turn out to be wrong, as again, the pacing for the adapted parts was very fast. Which brings me onto a question. For those of you unfamiliar with the book, how was the overall pace of Season 5? Too fast, too slow, or a mix of both and quite inconsistent? Be sure to let me know, as I'm genuinely curious. And the very last thing I want to talk about before we get into the actual season itself is something that, as far as I recall, I haven't really talked about in this series. Those being the letter hacks at the end of volumes. These are basically Robert Kirkman responding to fans writing in. And these contain a ton of information that, in retrospect, I wish I had brought up in seasons before, since many questions people often raise are answered by these. Though regardless, there is one I want to bring up here specifically, as this is the start of a very common criticism of the series. People who say they stopped watching The Walking Dead when it stopped being about the quote-unquote Walking Dead. Well, in issue 6, released in March of 2004, when a reader said they enjoyed Kirkman's take on the apocalypse where zombies are incidental, and the main tale was actually all about the survivors, Kirkman himself said that the Walking Dead name has never and will never refer to the zombies. And this was stated by Kirkman more than a year before Rick's claim that they are the Walking Dead appears in the comics. So, yeah, sorry to break it to you, but the story was never intended to be about the zombies. All they are is a part of the setting in what is otherwise a story about what happens to humanity once the world ends. But with all that said, let us finally get into the premiere. The episode opens pretty much exactly like you'd expect, with a few members of Rick's group being escorted to what is, for lack of a better word, a butchery. And one thing to note straight away, the way this entire sequence is handled from a horror point of view is pretty much perfect in my opinion. You very much get the horror tropes of hearing saws in the distance, one of them calmly sharpening a knife, etc. It just sets the tone for this place incredibly well. And a couple of interesting things to mention here. First off, as I already said in the Season 4 video, we see that the guy Rick met while he was out on a run with Carol has somehow ended up in Terminus as well. Though they don't get any sort of reunion as he is the first in the lineup, and that's the end of that. Though there's also a very explicit wink at the comic book folks in this one, because Glenn is the first in the lineup out of Rick's group. Obviously, for those familiar with the Negan storyline, this scene carried a much different meaning at the time. And because a precedent for killing very major characters early was already set with the likes of Andrea and even Lori to a certain extent, for that brief moment, you'd be forgiven for thinking that this may just be the end for Glenn. especially with this being an entirely new storyline with so much build-up. Though, obviously, he is saved in the nick of time by Gareth asking them about a previous shot count, which interrupts them. And taking a step back for a second, I do think the fact that everyone would ultimately get out of Terminus without a scratch was a bit of a stretch to say the least. And I was more than willing to suspend my disbelief enough to accept the whole coincidence of all them meeting back up in the train car in the first place. And while yes, it does convey how hardened Rick's group has gotten, especially Carol, I still think Terminus was a little too organized to go down that easily. So that is a very minor nitpick I have with this episode. Though the last thing to mention in this scene is of course Rick telling Gareth about what's in the bag. He names all the weapons and finishes with a machete with a red handle. That's what I'm going to use to kill you. And all of that is combined with that deranged, almost dead look in his eyes that is present throughout much of the 5th season. I think it's pretty safe to say that this is a very iconic scene that also gives an interesting parallel between Gareth and Rick, especially after Rick's rampage on the Claimers. Both of them are very much murderers. Yet somehow, despite Gareth calmly smiling with Rick openly telling him that he'll kill him, makes Gareth even more messed up. Though in case you don't remember why I brought it up since it has been a very long time, I won't ruin the machete for you now, you'll just have to find out in a couple of minutes. In the meantime though, Carol of course has been setting up her assault to save the group, marking the episode where Rambo Carol was born. In terms of her story, this is pretty much where all of that culminates. She puts all the messed up things she's lived through to good use and almost single-handedly wipes out the entirety of Terminus. As for Rick, they break out and begin to fight their way back to the train cart with the rest of the group. Though notice how Rick is wearing his murder jackets, so you know what that means. This scene of him just mowing them down was like, yeah, he's really embracing that murder jacket energy. And one last thing, there is still Tyrese to talk about in all this. While Carol makes her way to Terminus, he stays behind to protect Judith, where he's forced to fight Martin after he threatens Judith. In terms of his story, I think this was sort of meant to mirror how hot-headed he was back in Season 4. So after he forgave Carol and finally came to terms with what happened, he tried to revert to a more humane perspective, which is why he spares Martin. This is of course despite him threatening a literal baby, so the fact that he spared what is quite literally the worst kind of person speaks magnitudes as to how much he wants to get away from his dark past. We'll talk about Tyrese's character a whole bunch later in the season, so for now, just keep that in mind. Though back on Rick's side of the story, that is essentially Terminus. They fight their way out in a single episode and the entire thing is wrapped up. In terms of structure, I don't think anyone expected it to move that fast, but it did. So my one-sentence summary of my thoughts on Terminus is that it is probably one of the best TV show exclusive storylines. Both the setup as well as the climax felt very rewarding, and I think in terms of character-centric stories, this was also a great payoff for many of them. Though with that, we get to the reunion. And oh boy, was this a wonderful sequence and a brilliant juxtaposition of everything that just happened. The scene of Rick asking Carol, "Did you do that?" and then just being at a loss for words and just saying thank you, carries so much more weight since it was him personally who sent her away. Yet still, she saved all of them and asked for nothing in return. Not to mention Rick and Carl reuniting with Judith and Sasha with Tyrese. That transition of Rick being absolutely ruthless to all of that falling away as he sees his daughter, who he has believed to be dead this entire time, is so beautifully done. And even the music in the background being very slightly dissonant, with the smoke going up behind them constantly being that one final reminder of the horror they just lived through, was perfect. And fittingly, This episode marks the absolute peak of The Walking Dead in terms of pure numbers, drawing a truly baffling 17.3 million live viewers and 22.4 when adjusted for DVR. Obviously, take these numbers with a pinch of salt, as these are just US TV based, so someone like me outside of the US or not watching on AMC but something like Fox etc. do not count toward these numbers. But I think they can be used as a quick generalized representation. In terms of raw numbers, no episode ever has managed to surpass it, though the Season 7 premiere came very close, though we'll address that when we come to it. But from now on, you can begin to ponder why people begun to drop off. Retention throughout Season 5 is very strong, but the overall trend, while being very slight, is still downward trending. In my humble opinion, it is a bit of a curious case, as at this particular point, I don't see any reason why someone who's watched for 5 seasons would have tuned out, such as in the case of Negan, who was indeed very polarizing for TV crowds, though much more on this later on. And just before we pick up the books, we've still got a bit of catch up to do in the adaptation, or more specifically, the group finding Gabriel. In terms of changes, the biggest one here is number 1, the group is super reluctant to go toward the noise, but it's Carl who pushes Rick to go and save him, so again drawing further from his dark comic book counterparts. But 2, the fact that it's not Gabriel who stumbles onto the group, but in fact them finding him surrounded by walkers. Very similar to the book, Gabriel tells them about the church, and almost right away, they arrive at said church. Though with that, let us finally pick up the books. To very quickly catch you up on where we left off, Ben and Billy are dead, and the group was being watched by someone in the woods. So we pick up with Dale and Andrea being understandably upset that both of their adopted sons are dead, though they're then surprised by a small group of walkers wandering out of the forest. All seems well until they hear Dale yell out for help, but he is quickly saved by Michonne. Though surprisingly, once Rick jokingly says, "You've gotta be more careful, old man," Dale has an outburst and fires back at Rick, which he obviously writes down to Dale just being upset. And after seeing this, we also see Carl calling him weak, which has even Rick taken aback a little. So yes, Carl is indeed becoming more and more emotionally messed up. Though we then cut to the nighttime and Andrea has to go to the bathroom, but once she steps out of sight, she notices a figure moving in the woods and yells out to the group. As of right now, they don't find anything, but this obviously puts Andrea on high alert. And all is not over just yet. As the night carries on, we see Carl crying by himself, showing that despite him seemingly being heartless when it comes to Dale etc., he does still have humanity left, and what he did to Billy does haunt him. For now, it's just setting up later plotlines, so just keep in mind that although Carl is very cold, he is still a kid. And in the meantime, Dale sneaks out of the van and goes off into the woods for a yet unknown reason. And a moment later, he is knocked out and taken by a couple of people, revealing that those people we saw before are still very much watching them. The next morning, Andrea obviously runs off in search of him, so the group then spends some time trying to find him. Though with Abraham saying that they've spent enough time trying to find him and that he is most likely gone, they get back on the road and shortly after arrive at Gabriel's church. And with that said, let us return to the adaptation for a bit. First and foremost, we start to get a teeny bit of conflict between Rick and Abe. While Rick and the group wants to rest for a little in Gabriel's church, and maybe go out on a run to gather some supplies, Abraham says that they should just leave for Washington straight away. As of right now, it's nothing super major, especially with Glenn, who's obviously spent more time with Abe, saying that they shouldn't split up again. And while Abe's not exactly a fan of the plan, he does go through with it for now. Oh, and I don't know why, and I admit I may be reading into this way too much, but I absolutely love this shot. The side of Rick carrying Judith being lit up, while the other with the gun is hidden in the shadows is so perfect. Though yeah, this may just be me nerding out a little too much. And the last thing to mention here is the conversation between Rick and Carl. That took place quite a bit earlier in the comic book, where Rick says that no matter what he thinks, he is not safe. In terms of the conversation itself, it's basically identical, it's just the context why he says it that is slightly different. Though with that, the group goes out on a supply run where we get the quite whimsical scene of Glenn lying about fighting a walker, when in reality, he just fell over. And yeah, Steven Yeun plays that perfectly. Though more importantly, we see a group led by Rick raid a food bank. They get in a bit of a dicey situation with a bunch of walkers, though ultimately they seem to be fine. Though when they get back, Carl lets Rick know that he has found something fishy going on after all, as they find "You will burn for this" carved in the side of the church. And before we continue on this plot thread, let us pick up the books. After arriving at the church, Andrea still holds out hope that Dale might be out there. That is, until she once again spots figures moving in the tree line. She immediately runs inside telling the group they're being watched, and confronts Gabriel about what is going on. Rick then takes over and demands answers as to how he's actually survived this long, etc. Oh, and by this point, as we've been talking about in past videos, Rick has completely returned to his leadership position, and that is pretty clear here. Though it's here where Gabriel breaks down and explains what happened. People screamed for his help, but he never opened the church and just listened while they were being torn apart by walkers. Since Rick is a cop, he is a pretty good judge of character, so he says that it's pretty clear that he's telling the truth. And while that may seem good, in actuality, the mystery of who is out there just got that much more dangerous, because none of them have any idea of who that may be. So yes, in terms of horror, planting Gabriel as a red herring was a very nice decision by Kirkman. Returning to the adaptation for a bit, following the successful food run, the group celebrates as Abraham delivers a speech how they should begin their journey to Washington. And in a very cute manner, Judith blubbers something, to which Rick responds, "Oh, if she's in, then I'm in too." And yes, on the background of everything that's about to happen, that is a pretty extreme juxtaposition, though it is admittedly very cute. We then cut to Carol, who is planning to leave on her own again. That is, until Daryl finds her. He tells her to come back with them, but they're suddenly surprised by a car marked with a cross. The same kind Daryl saw back in Season 4. So with that, Daryl immediately says to get in the car as they begin to chase it. In many ways, this storyline for Daryl is very similar to that of Sophia's, though the major difference will come in its conclusion. To keep things simple, we'll cover that next time as that's not entirely relevant here, but yes, with that, they both go after her with no one else in the group knowing. And finally, we cut to Bob, who's sitting on a grave and smiling as he sees the group celebrating. And sheesh, I don't know why, but this particular scene really hits different. As I talked about in late Season 4, Bob's journey was such a beautiful one of him finally overcoming that fear and basically finding a family. And even up to the very end, he just sits there and smiles. That is, until he's knocked over the head in a Dale-like fashion and is carried off. When he awakens, he is met with a horrific sight. Gareth calmly saying that he's not dead yet, though that he shouldn't read into the word yet. And we then get the absolutely perfectly adapted scene of his realization, as he looks around and slowly but surely pieces together what has happened, until we suddenly zoom out and see that his leg is gone, and Gareth casually chowing down. And yes, the way the reveal is handled captured the horror of the comic 110%. Everything from very elegantly leaving context clues as to what happened to him, to the final reveal was just perfect. And I can't even imagine what would be going through my head if I wasn't familiar with the story beforehand. Though with that said, let us address the comic book where the events play out very similarly. We cut to Dale waking up, and in a very similar fashion we get angles where his leg is never visible. The major difference of course comes from the fact that we have absolutely no clue who these people are, whereas we had at least seen Gareth before. Hello, editing Korotos here. I think I didn't emphasize enough the fact that in the book, we had no clue who these people were. In the TV series, we already saw what they were up to with their butchery and everything like that. Well, in the book, this came completely out of left field. So there was also quite a bit more shock factor to this reveal in the original story. It's not a super big deal, but I just wanted to point that out in case you haven't read it yourself. Though in both versions, Bob and Dale reveal that they are tainted meat while laughing the entire thing off, which clearly sends the hunters into a frenzy. And with that, we get to what I honestly think is top 3 episode material. That being 503, 4 Walls and a Roof. The absolute horror of this episode, for me at least, is still among the best in the entire series. Even comparing to Negan, the Whisperers, and basically everything that has come afterwards, including the TV show exclusive storylines in season 11. And Sasha, stepping in for Andrea, calls out Gabriel, which in the TV version is actually quite a bit more serious, since both Daryl and Carol have also gone missing. So with that, very similar to the source material, Rick confronts him and Gabriel tells them about all the people who died at his doors, and breaks down while saying that he heard entire families begging and damning him. Finally ending by saying that Rick has been sent here as his punisher. Though this is interrupted as they see Bob being left at the doors. This is pretty much adapted one for one, with the exception of the obvious character switch, and Glenn being grazed by a bullet in the brief exchange they have while Dale is being dropped off. Though Eugene quickly patches him up and he is back to normal, so no big deal there. In both versions, they try to share as much as they know, before revealing that they were bitten already, explaining while Dale went off into the woods on his own, and Bob sitting outside by himself. So with that, they try to just make them as comfortable as they can, while planning a way to strike back at the hunters. Though in the adaptation, another conflict breaks out between Rick and Abe, as Abe says that they should just head out straight away, but Rick tells him that they are not taking the bus. Though before they can start throwing fists, Glenn steps in and brokers a deal saying that he'll go with Abe if they stick around and help them. So yes, this is clearly a far cry from Rick and the group joining Abe almost straight away back at the farm, as even after reaching this deal with Glenn, they still wouldn't be entirely on the same page. In the book on the other hand, they very quickly agree that they will track them down and hit them right in their home base, and so they head out. Though we're never told exactly what they're up to, as we cut to the hunters talking about how they may have messed up when trying to pull Dale, but ending by saying that, no, the group must be scared of them now. Only to be interrupted by Rick saying, no, we're perfectly fine, as he walks straight into the backyard they're holed up in. Very similar to the adaptation, he very much comes in with that I am in control vibe. And so they do exchange a few words first, where the leader of the hunters explains that they were out of food and that they had no choice but to hunt people. Though as Rick shows that he's clearly disgusted by them, their leader responds by saying that he shouldn't have come here. Which is when Rick pulls his trump card, shooting a finger gun at one of them as their ear just flies off, revealing that they have this entire place surrounded. But as they realize that they're beaten and give up, Rick just says, hold him down, as we only see their bloodied weapons and then them burning the bodies. And while we never see exactly what happened, In terms of portraying horror, this sort of implied way of showing it in many ways can be even more effective, because it's going to be you who will fill the blanks with the worst thing imaginable. Many authors leverage this to their own benefit in a quite wide variety of genres. Even something like the process of creating a Horcrux in Harry Potter, it's always implied that it's very brutal, but we are never told what exactly it is. And most character backstories in the comic are also handled this way instead of a traditional flashback. So ultimately, it's your imagination that will make it as bad as you want it to be. And just because it is human nature to be afraid of the unknown, it will probably be pretty bad. Though, I'll admit, I think the way it was remixed for the adaptation was even better, as they never actually go to hunt him down. Instead, they do exactly what Terminus itself was. A few of them stay behind as bait, only for them to be boxed in by the rest of the group. And then those suppressed shots from behind as we hear Rick but still don't see him, and he just says, "Put your guns on the floor and kneel," and then shooting off Garrett's finger as he emerges from the darkness, it's all just perfect. And then comes the climax. Garrett sits there and says that they could have killed him already, so why didn't he? There must have been a reason for that. Only for Rick to calmly say, "We didn't want to waste the bullets. Besides, I already made you a promise," as he pulls out the machete with the red handle and embraces the jacket. The pure horror of the scene was remarkable. Even all the small details, like the entire episode being quite literally very dark until the hunters are wiped out, the whole not wasting bullets part, and even members of their own group being terrified of what Rick and the others are doing, etc, etc. It's among my favorite stories in both versions, so of course I'll gush about it, though I honestly couldn't be happier with the way it was adapted. From start to finish, it was an absolute 10 out of 10. Oh, and one last thing. The machete with the red handle became so legendary that an entire webisode was created to detail its journey. It is a pretty cool mini-story, so I do recommend giving it a watch. Though yes, remember that Rick always keeps his promises, especially when it comes to machetes with a red handle. But with that, one of their own is still bit, so we've still got a tragedy on our hands. In the book, Rick goes to talk to Dale, where Dale thanks him for being their leader when no one else could. The exchange between them is quite emotional since Dale has been around since the very start, and we know that they've had conflicts before, so this sort of final conversation between them does carry a lot of weight. But we then just cut to Rick waking up to the gunshots as Andrea just sits there. In the adaptation, we see Bob share some final words with Rick, where, very similar to the book, he just thanks him, saying that he didn't know that there were any good people out there, but Rick took him in. And even on his very deathbed, Bob smiles the entire time. Though Tyrese obviously knows that Sasha can't put Bob down, so he does it instead, and he's given a burial. Though one of the final things to mention in this episode, which, yes, is absolutely packed, is the final conversation between Rick and Abraham. As per their agreements, Abraham gives Rick a map of their route to Washington, saying that he hopes to meet them there, and then adding that he and the group should be there for what happens next. So, Rick promises that he will, and Abe's group heads off. This is a very substantial change from the books, as this sort of split never happens in the Road to Washington arc. So once again, quite a few people familiar with the source material were left thinking about just what is going on here, including me, who was fairly certain that at this point, Alexandria was still a very long ways off. But with that said, we do get another legendary scene that, with how the series looks right now, hits so much harder. Obviously, Abraham is Big Man Abe, so it's not like he can just apologize to Rick. Instead, he leaves a message with an apology and saying that the new world's going to need Rick Grimes. Yes, Abe, it really does, doesn't it? Well, now I'm sad. Rick movies 2022? 2023? 2024? Anyway, another very small yet very dense scene was the brief exchange between Rick and Tyrese while they're digging the graves. Rick says, "I never asked how it was for you, getting to Terminus," only for Tyrese to think for a moment and respond, "It killed me." And sheesh, the emotional baggage packed in those 3 words is like, wow. Obviously, the first thing that comes to mind is the events of the Grove. You don't walk away from something like that unchanged, even if he wasn't the one to pull the trigger. Though what is probably on his mind at this very moment is the fact that he spared Martin. And maybe it was because of his inaction that Bob is now dead and that his sister is devastated. I think in many ways, Tyrese's arc this season can be viewed as a sort of a what I couldn't do. Like we saw with Martin, like we saw in the church, like we saw in the Grove, etc, etc. And how that makes him feel guilty for the things that may happen. Though in this particular situation, Rick ends the conversation by just saying, "No, it didn't." As to how you read into this line, I honestly think there are nearly infinite possibilities. Is he talking about himself and how him ripping the dude's throat out and going on a rampage etc killed him? Or maybe he's talking about how Tyrese's humanity is still there? Or maybe it's just a very literal "no it didn't," since they are digging graves for people who didn't make it, or maybe it's a mixture of all those things. Though regardless, I do think this is a brilliant little scene that makes you wonder just what they meant by that. Though the very final thing in this episode is of course Daryl popping out of the woods in the middle of the night, at the sight of which Michonne is obviously happy, though the dread soon sets in as she reads Daryl's face and realizes that things have gone very wrong. As for the books, the final thing to mention are the final pages of issue 66, where we see Rick talking to who he believes to be Abraham about how what he did to the hunters still haunts him, saying he can still see every bashed skull, every bone, all after they took their weapons. And then saying Carl probably couldn't even look at him if he knew. And finally, when he's met with silence saying, "Abraham?" as he turns around, only to see a stunned Carl, who begins to cry and simply says, "I killed Ben." Aside from the obvious implications of Rick now knowing what Carl has been dealing with himself, I think this drew a very powerful parallel between him and his father. Both of them have done horrible things, but both of them are still haunted by them. Like we've seen, Carl has spent nights just crying by himself, and like he himself says, those sorts of things haunt Rick as well. In terms of narrative, I think this was just Kirkman's way of reminding us that no matter how dark Rick and the survivors may seem, they never want to do those things, and it does haunt them. This sort of morality question will be brought up quite a bit later in Season 5 itself, so we will no doubt be returning to it very soon. But with that said, I think this is a pretty good stopping point for this first batch of episodes, as this script is already over 10 pages. In terms of differences at this point in the story, Dale's death is replaced by Bob, Abraham's group consisting of his trio, along with Tara, Maggie, and Glenn, have diverged from Rick's group. Also, Carol has now been taken by the same group that took Beth back in Season 4, but Daryl has made it back. And finally, Carl has come clean about killing Ben to Rick. But with that, next time we'll continue our way through what I still honestly think is one of the best seasons of the show to date, and talk about all the great and not so great plot lines that came out of it. And that's the video. And a quick update regarding the series. For those of you who watch my One Piece content, you will have already heard this, but I'm working upwards of 100 hours per week right now, so video production time has been severely cut down. And that will continue through to March, so don't be surprised if I do end up disappearing for a bit. I do still work on these pretty much every single free moment I get, so hopefully that won't slow it down too much. Though as always, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons who, especially in situations like this, help me to produce even more of these for you all. And speaking of which, let us give a warm welcomes to the newest member of the team, Then Active Monkey. Seriously, thank you. And if you wish to join the highly coveted Mystery Shack Insiders Club, you can do so for as little as 1 buckaroo per month. And last but not least, let us do the usual secret phrase to see how many of you stuck around until the very end. Leave a comment, whatever it may be, and include the words, "The new world's going to need ice cream." Other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.